So let's create one more file. We'll copy the ID file, say 6th, and we'll try to work with class and ID together. Okay, let's open this file. All right, so let's have a green border. Let's create a green border of class, right? And then we're gonna have a red border as well. So I'm gonna have a red border of ID, green border of this, then we're gonna have italics of a class. Okay, so I'm mix and matching the IDs and class selectors. So this is nothing but the ID selector, then I have two class selectors, one red border as ID selector, green border as class selector, and italics as the class selector. Right, now let's remove all these other conditions that we have. Okay, and let's remove all these things. Let's understand the difference between ID and a class. Okay, one thing we know, if you want to apply a class, right, you can have green border. You can also have ID and class together, but you need to know which one will get executed. So if I say red border, okay, so when I have class and ID assigned to one HTML tag, you can see the red border has been assigned. Okay, it's here, right? You can see the differences. The red border has been assigned. It doesn't match which preference you write it. Means if you write it like this, it doesn't really matter the sequence, but ID has more preference than class. Means if you have class and ID and you have a rule that is been applied in class and ID, the ID takes the preference. If the rule is same, then ID take the preference of applying that rule. Okay, that's one difference that you have to understand between ID and the class. You know, if you have a class, you can have multiple selectors, and if you have ID, it says red border, right? So you can see the italics is still applied. That's basically the green border has been replaced with the red border because there is a clash between the same rules, same properties. So it takes the higher preference of the property for ID, and then the text italics have no clash, so it's just applied the text italics. So it is taking all the rules, then it's doing some kind of comparison between ID and a class, and the ID rules applied first, then whatever is the leftover of all the rules that has been applied onto the HTML tags. Right, so remember these two most important difference. ID has more preference than class, and if you have ID and a class, all the additional rules that you have will be applied onto the HTML tags. Okay, that's why you see text italics is been applied even though ID has more preference over the class, because ID doesn't talk about text italics. Okay, that's one of the classic differences between ID and a class. So let's look at attribute selectors. So I'm going to copy paste this. I'm going to make it 8. Call it attribute selector. I'm going to delete all the ones that we don't need it. So I'm going to delete all these things. Now delete all the tags. Right? And we'll call it as attribute selector. Okay, and how do you define an attribute selector? You have a selector, so inside the selector you can mention the class name and you can mention inside the square brackets, and this is basically you're defining the attribute of an HTML. You're checking whether if this attribute is available inside the HTML tag, then apply this rule. Okay, I'll give you a class an example for this. I'll say if the p tag has class, means if you have defined a class attribute for any of the p tags, any value, but attribute is present, then apply this rule. Okay, then make color as red. Okay, and font weight as bold. Okay, and it's simple to understand. If you have a p tag, this is a paragraph. Okay, the rule will not be applied. But when you have a paragraph, we'll just make it and say class, it has an attribute of class, then the rule is applied. Okay, it's easy to see the rule is only applied when you have an attribute as class. Doesn't care what value it is, but if you just have the attribute, then this rule will be applied. That's nothing but the attribute selector. You can even go a little complex than this. You can mention color, you can mention class. If the attribute is, say the attribute name is color blue, okay, then the color is blue, and then you mention this. Right now let's have an HR tag. Okay, if you just have the class, then the red will be applied. But if you have this color blue as the value, doesn't require to define it, but it's just taking that attribute. If the class has this value, then you see the blue is applied, which is nothing but this rule is applied. But if you don't have any value, means you have the class tag, but if you have like something else, then nothing but this rule is applied. Okay, so this attribute selector is really checking the attributes of an HTML tag. So one condition we said, right, if you have a class attribute, apply this rule. If the class attribute has this value, then apply this rule. That's nothing but this one. Alright, so let's look at some more selectors. So let's look at a child selector. Okay, let's open this up. Let's say this is child. Okay, child is really like a child, like a parent and a child. You want to apply, if this parent is available and this is the child, then apply onto the child elements. Okay, so for this you have selector, and then you can mention which child of it. Okay, using this greater than symbol, you're just mentioning, okay, this is a parent on the left hand side, right hand side is a child. Okay, so let's look at one example of it. How do you write a child selector? Let's say you have a paragraph, and inside a paragraph you have an anchor tag. I want to apply this rule for the anchor tag only when it is inside the paragraph tag. All right, and I want to make it color red. Okay, let's look at an example of this. Okay, this is a paragraph of text. Okay, to the paragraph I want to have an anchor tag. And you can see the paragraph will be red in color, right? That's basically the child selector, only when the anchor tag is inside the parent tag. So what happens if the anchor tag is outside? Okay, there's no impact, it's blue in color. Okay, dark blue in color. So the impact is only available when anchor tag is inside the p tag, means anchor tag is a child tag to the p tag. Okay, what happens if you have like this? Let's write another rule, and let's say div tag and a tag. Okay, and then we'll say color is green and font weight is bold. Okay, let's write some div tags. Okay, now you have a div tag and a p tag. Okay, you have two rules. One is a under p is red, and one is a under div tag, that is green. So let's see how this will behave when the anchor tag is inside the p tag. Okay, so you can have an anchor tag here, and you can say lorem ipsum. Okay, and you can see the red is been applied. the red is nothing but this is applied because this has more preference over this, and you can see the green when it is inside the div tag, right? So understand how the parent and the child works. This is the child for this parent, this is the child for this immediate parent. So that's why the red is applied and the green is applied for this rule. So that's nothing but the child selector, and it is defined with the greater than symbol. The left hand side is the parent, right hand side is the child. When they go in this sequence, then only apply this rule. That's what the child selector says. Let's look at the another selector called descendant selector. This is the 10th one. Okay, let's open that up. Okay, and we call it as descendant selector. Okay, the descendant selector have something called a space. Okay, space means this is somewhere in the hierarchy, but this is the parent, and there's somewhere in the hierarchy and it is the child. Okay, a very good example is body. Okay, so inside the body you have any anchor tag, please make it red in color. Okay, irrespective of the div tags and p tags. So you see the a tag is under p tag, a tag is outside, a tag is under div tag, a tag is under p tag. But this descendant selector says apply this rule whenever it is inside the body, irrespective of the hierarchy. So if you see, all the link tags become red in color. That's basically this rule says, descendant, that there is no immediate relation between child and parent, but anywhere in the hierarchy, means if I am the parent and he is the child, irrespective of under any other parents, right, apply this rule. So it's a global condition that you apply, right? Inside this body, if you have any anchor tag, all the anchor tags, so any anchor tag inside the body, this rule will be applied to it. And how you define the descendant selectors, you mention something called a space. Okay, and once you have space, means this becomes the parent, this becomes the child. Okay, and if you just say div tag, okay, you can see this is not applied because this is under the paragraph. Okay, this parent and the child could be anywhere. You see p, under p also a tag is there, so that's why the relationship still exists between parent and the child irrespective of the sequence. All right, so that's how the descendant selectors work. Let's look at adjacent sibling selector. Let me type it. Adjacent sibling selector. Okay, let's open that file. Okay, the adjacent selector goes with a symbol called plus. Okay, if div plus a. Okay, let's look at where it has been applied. So no condition has been applied, there's no anchor tag become red. So this rule says the div and the a must be adjacent and sibling, right? What is adjacent and what is sibling? So let me give you an example. So if you see here, the anchor tag is inside p tag, and anchor tag div tag is having anchor tag, but this is not adjacent. You know what is adjacent means? Adjacent means, let me put that for you. Okay, if you're having some text here, okay, it has to be sibling as well. This is parent and a child, right? A is under div, means a becomes child, div becomes parent. Then what is sibling means? Sibling means they are side by side, right? They are side by side, they are adjacent and side by side. That's why you see the rule has been applied now, color red. Okay, they are sibling and they are adjacent, means if you have, let's say you have h1 tag here, right? Now div and a are not adjacent. They are siblings, but they are not adjacent. Okay, adjacent means the rule has to be applied right after the div tag, then only this rule will be applied, and it is called as, here is applied, it's called as adjacent sibling selector, which is nothing but denoted with plus, which means they have to be at the same hierarchy, that is the same sibling, same hierarchy level, cannot be inside like parent and child, it should be under the same level, and then it should be immediate right after that tag, then only this rule is applied. Adjacent means one after the other, sibling means same level, and that's how the rule is applied when you mention it as a plus. The a tag has to be right after the div tag, and it should be under the same sibling. All right, so let's look at another example. Let's look at another example, which is called as general adjacent sibling selector. So it's called as general adjacent sibling selector. Let's open this up. It's same as adjacent sibling selector with some differences. Okay, and it is denoted by the tilde symbol. This is a symbol you can find beside the number 1 keyboard. This is a tilde, right? So now you say tilde, okay, and you can see this special case, this case, right? You can see the color red is been applied. You can see color red is applied even though they are not in the same adjacent. Okay, this is basically general, means it is at the same sibling, but don't have to be right after the div. It could be after anywhere in the same sibling, but not adjacent. Okay, so you can say this rule says same sibling but not adjacent. Okay, so if you look at even this example, you have an HR tag. Okay, you can see the rule is keep applying because the rule says same sibling. Okay, if you have a tag inside a div tag, that rule is not applied, but if it is sibling anywhere in the hierarchy, then this rule has been applied. That's nothing but general adjacent sibling selector denoted with tilde. Alright, so these are the 12 selector rules that we're going to use to write CSS. Make sure if you want to learn some important topics in CSS, you learn the selector section. Okay, selectors is nothing but tell you how you write your rules. Once you understand how to write the rules, you can refer to the guides and all those references to understand what are the property and the value. Just apply property and the value, but you need to know where and how you need to apply it and how to play around with the CSS. If there is inside a page, if there's one corner of the page you want to apply one style to it, you need to know how do you transverse and reach to that particular section of the page. Okay, with this rule, selector rules, it will help you to identify that particular section in the page and apply that rule only onto that HTML tag. All right, so that's all about how to work with selector, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Hello and welcome to the lecture on pseudo classes and elements. So let's understand how to write pseudo classes and elements. Okay, let's create a file. We'll call it as pseudo class. Then we'll look at pseudo elements. Okay, we'll use a boilerplate. So we'll go to type selector, copy this. So we'll go to selector, copy this as a boilerplate, and then we'll go to our pseudo classes. We paste it here. Okay, then we'll call it as pseudo selector CSS. Okay, this is a class, pseudo class. We'll see what a pseudo class means and how to write it. Okay, so how to write pseudo classes. Okay, for some of the selectors you have something called as pseudo classes, which you can define it via colon, and then you can mention the pseudo class. You can define the class or basically the attribute for that specific selector. Okay, let's take an example of anchor tag. Okay, anchor tag have pseudo classes, like it has link. Okay, and also it has visited. If someone has clicked that link, what action you want to show on that link, means you want to change the property of that attribute. Hover and then active. Okay, so let's write these conditions here. For the link, I want the color to be blue, right? Someone visited, I want the color to be gray, means it's showing that you have already visited this link. Someone go on the link, hover means when you mouse over the link you make it red, and active means green. Okay, so let's write our anchor tags here. So we'll define 3 links. We'll say hash, so we can say home page. We can actually give different links so that we know whether it's visited or not. Okay, and then 3. Contact in the about page. Okay, so we have 3 links with the different hrefs, and you will see the pseudo classes is been applied onto anchor tags depending on the action that has been happening on that tag. So if I refresh this page, let's close this, open up the new live editor. Right, so everything is in blue in color, right? You see when you hover on it, it becomes red in color. That's basically coming up from this. Okay, it's red in color when you hover on it. That's called hovering, right? So when you click something, right, when you visited that page, it becomes gray. So let's click this. Right, now this link has become gray because of this property. You have visited that, so that's why it become the gray. You can click on contact, you can click on the home page. Okay, so what is active? When you click and hold, you can see it's active, right? Click and hold, it's active. Click and hold, it's active, it's green. Where here are some of the pseudo classes. So some of the tags will have pseudo classes wherein you can play around of its attribute, how you want to define it, and you can change the property of it when you basically write some condition in the CSS. Like one good example is a hovering. When you hover on this link, you want to change the color. Maybe when you hover on an image, you want to change the image. Those kind of things can be done via the pseudo classes. Okay, so let's look at pseudo elements. So for this, I'll create one more file. And I'll call it pseudo elements. Okay, let's open this file. Okay, the pseudo elements is defined with double colon. Okay, let's define some pseudo element. I'll define a pseudo element for h1, and I'll say after this tag, what you want to do. After this tag, I want to add a content of, let's say I want to add like this, right? So after every h1 tag, you will see these symbols. Whatever symbol you can add, like this, or you want to add dashes or whatever symbol that you add it here will be available. So this content is available after the h1 tag. Okay, so we have an h1 tag here, and if you see the h1 tag, so you see the exclamatory mark is basically coming after the heading. So even the text is not there, you are adding that content via the pseudo elements. Okay, this is how you define a pseudo element, and then you can do whatever conditions or rules you want to apply onto that element. Another good example is for paragraph, for the p tag, the first letter, right, you want to increase the size. So you will say font size of 200%, and let's say you write a p. This is a text which has first letter bigger, right? And you go ahead over here, see the first letter is 200%. You can increase to 500%. Okay, you can see you can play around with your text as well with something called a pseudo element. Pseudo elements work before and after most of the times, and you can change the behavior of the text using this pseudo elements as well. Okay, how you define it? You define it with double colon. Pseudo classes with colon and pseudo elements with double colon. Okay, so that's all about pseudo classes and elements, and I'll see you the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on CSS precedence. Precedence is basically understanding how the rules will be applied onto the HTML pages, in what sequence these rules will be applied, and which get the higher priority to apply that rule onto the HTML. Okay, we have looked about so many selectors, we have looked at inline, external, and all those type of CSS that we can apply onto HTML page. Now we'll take a step back and understand, when we apply all these rules, which gets the higher precedence, means which get executed and applied onto the HTML tags. Okay, so we'll look at various examples of how the CSS rules apply onto the HTML tags. So for that, we'll create one folder and I'll call it CSS Rules. We'll create a file, precedence. Let's quickly open this up in the brackets. Right, so I'm going to copy paste some of the CSS rules here, then we'll understand how the precedence will work. So I've copy pasted some of the CSS rules and simple plain HTML tags. We have seen through all these examples of how to write CSS and how to use them. So let's understand what is the CSS here and how the order of preference works. Okay, so we have for H1 we have blue color, for P we have applied green color, for P and H1 both we have applied color red. Okay, so H1 have blue, P has green. When you write P comma H1, means same rule applied for both of them. I made it red. So let's see whether the head and P will have blue, green or red. Then for div I have red. Then for ID selectors I have used color blue, that is text blue. Text green is a class selector. Then for div text blue, means when you say div and text blue, I have made it light blue. So let's see, when you use and combine all this CSS together, how they behaves and which one gets executed first. Okay, so let's do the div tag first. So when say div ID, I'm gonna say text blue, that's nothing but the ID class selector. Then we will have a class text green. Okay, so we have both the colors, text blue and text green, and all the text here like CSS rules, which is more specific, has more precedence. Okay, we will add a BR here. ID has more precedence than class. Yeah, okay, so let's view this file. Okay, here we have applied this rule to the div tag, blue and text green, but you can see the light blue has been applied. The div text blue, the div text blue has more preference. This has more preference over these two. Obviously the ID has more preference than the class, but if you attach it with a div tag and then for that ID, for div for that ID, this rule is applied. So it is CSS rule which has more specific, okay, has more precedence. Even though the text blue, this blue was not applied, the light blue was applied. All right, so let's look one more example. All right, So let's look at the h1 and p tags. So for h1 and p tags, we have these three conditions: h1 blue, p green, and p and h is red. Okay, you can see both of them are red. The reason behind it is more specific. P and h you are saying has to be red in color, right? That's why they are in red in color, right? The individual definitions plus a combination of tags definition has more preference than the individual ones. Okay, so understand these differences. We'll create one more file and then we'll understand it. We'll create one more file out of it. We'll say inheritance. We'll see how the inheritance work. So in this we will remove all this. Okay, and we will have a body. So for body we'll do coloring. We'll say color is white. Okay, and background color is red, right? Now this has been applied for everything because that's the body tag. Then now you will override. Okay, h1, okay, we'll say text decoration underline. So we have the underline here, and we say background color change for h1, right? You say black. Okay, so this is basically you're overriding the styles that has been applied. So first the body was applied, then the h1 was applied, and now let's do a black screen. For black screen we say background color is black. So now what we can do is we can just try to understand the concepts, how it actually works. Okay, let's write a p class. Black screen. Okay, okay, and let's write an anchor tag here. Okay, and whatever you're gonna write it here, this is a test. Okay, this is basically the black screen is applied even to the internal tags. You can see even the anchor tag is getting that black screen. Okay, this is basically the hierarchy. So whatever the parent is having the class, it is applied onto the child tags as well. Okay, and also if you apply the same rule onto the parent element, all the child elements can override it, and also if they don't override, they by default get the parent element. Like paragraph text, we haven't override the paragraph text style, so it took the style from the body and applied it for himself. So this is basically a concept of inheritance, whereas the paragraph is inheriting the styles of body. Here the p tag is overriding the parent's style, right? It is overriding the black screen. So this is how you can basically play around with having inheritance. Like you can define one common style you want for everybody, then you can override whatever styles you want for specific individual tags. Okay, and remember, when you override that specific, the more specific will be applied to the rule, right? h1 has more specific rule, so h1 conditions will be applied onto the CSS styling. All right, so let's look one more example and let's call it last. Let's do the third one, and this is called as last win rules. Okay, whatever is a rule that is in the last will get higher preference. Okay, let's do that example. So I'm removing all the styles, I'm removing all the text. Let's understand it. So we'll define some styles here. We'll say body has color red. Similarly, the color red we want to put for h1 and p tag. So all the h1 p body should be in red in color. Okay, and then we are saying we create one more id selector and of text red, and we'll say color is red. Then we'll do a class. Okay, and what we can do is we will now do h1 and h1 dot text red. Okay, so what we are trying to do is we are trying all the ways to make body h and p as red in color. Okay, then we'll look at which conditions wins first. Okay, you remember about the inline style sheet, so we'll do an inline style sheet and we'll say color is green, right? Then we'll also apply the class text red. Then we'll also apply id text red, and we'll say headings. So can you guess? Okay, you cannot see the output, so can you guess which of the condition is been applied to headings? That's what we are talking about. Which is the last condition that has been applied onto the h1 tag? Well, that's the green, not the red. We have even done so many ways of applying this red onto h1. We have defined the id and the class specific to h1. We even did the body as red, h1 as red, but you know, the last condition that's applied is the inline style sheet. So remember this, whenever you have any CSS anywhere written, if you want to have a CSS specific at that moment of time and you want that to apply onto your HTML tag, you can go ahead with the inline style sheet. All right, so let's do a last example, and that is called as important rule. Okay, let's open this up. In the same condition, let's say you want h1 to be red in color, right? You want this red to be applied to your conditions and you don't want anybody to override it. You don't want anyone in line to override it. What you can simply do is you can go to the h1 and you can say important, right? Exclamatory mark, and you're saying a word called important. So when you say important, nobody can inherit it anymore. You try to inherit also, the important one gets executed. This is one of the way to make sure nobody inherits your property or nobody overrides your property. Okay, you can mention this anywhere you want, it will still be applied onto your tag, right? So this is basically called as important rule. Basically you do an exclamatory mark and then you use a word called important. So wherever you apply this, that rule cannot be overridden. Okay, and that rule will always be get executed. Okay, so these are the 4 types that we have seen. Precedence we have seen, inheritance we have seen, when we have seen the last win rule, that's basically the inline style sheet. Then we have looked at important rule, which basically means you cannot override it. Okay, it's always get executed. So these are some of the things that you should know when you work with CSS. How is the precedence works, how inheritance works, and how to make a logical decision. When you're writing the CSS, you should know, when I write this, will it be applied or will it be overridden by something else? You will always have this challenge wherein you're writing CSS but it's not getting executed. That's basically these 4 concepts will help you understand how to make sure your CSS will be applied onto your HTML tags, and even though other CSS will be available for it to apply, yours get the most higher preference to apply onto the HTML tags. Well, that's all about precedence and CSS rules, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on colors and text. So let's learn some properties about colors and text. So I'm going to create a folder. You create 2 different files, one for colors and one for text. Right, so let's open this up. You can take any of this as a boilerplate and we'll copy paste this and we'll remove everything. Right, and we will say colors, and colors here. So let's understand, when you deal with colors, okay, you can go to this site htmlcolorcodes.com Let me open this up, and this will tell you different types of color coding that you have. You have hexa and RGB and HSL. Okay, you can choose any color you want, right? And he will give you the hash and RGB or an HSL or CMYK. Okay, and you can see how you can apply this onto the web page. Well, you can take this hexadecimal value or an RGB value and see how you can apply this onto your web page. Okay, so from this website HTML color codes, you can pick any color, or you can choose any of the colors that you like you want. Take from the palette, you can choose this color, then you get the hexadecimal and RGB. Then we'll try to use this value and print the same color onto our web page. Okay, that's the example we'll see here. So first thing we will do is we will define our style. We'll define different styles of it. Okay, so I'm going to copy paste this URL and I'm going to paste it here. Okay, so let's define our div tag. We'll say padding is 10px, and we'll make the width of that box as 50%. So you get a nice box, right? Font size is, if you write a font inside it, you get the 40px fonts. Okay, I'm just drawing a box, simple box, padding of 10, so that's an padding, 4 sides padding. Then you have a width, so this is a box like a 50% width, right? Then we will try to add colors now. So I'm going to add a red box, okay, using RGB. Okay, and let's say, how do you add the background color for that box? You can see the background color, and you can really type RGB, and you can pass R value, G value and B value. So if you want to draw a red color, you just say red and everything else is 0, right? And the text color will be white. Similarly, if you want the same red box using the hexadecimals, right? You want in hex. Okay, instead of RGB, you can mention the hash code of it, which is FF0000. Okay, similarly in the text, if you have a name, you can simply say red and it will still work. And you can even say, you know, dark or light of it, which you can say dark red, light red, red, you know, all those things. Okay, so now you have created this CSS. Let's create some boxes and we'll see how it works. Okay, the first box we'll create is RGB with red box with RGB. So we'll say red box RGB, right? And we'll say red box RGB, which is nothing but 255 0, 0. Okay, this will draw a nice red box. You can see the nice red box has been drawn here, right? You can now, let's draw the another boxes. Okay, this time we will use the hex, right? And you can see the box is still drawn there, which is nothing but hash FF0000. Okay, you can continue to do this by saying red, box name, not red. Okay, okay, and then dark name, I believe. Okay, you got the dark red box here. All right, so you can see it's so simple to work with colors in this. If you pick any of these colors, let's say let's pick some colors here. Let's say you pick this color, you can get the RGB value, that's the hexadecimal value. You can directly go ahead and paste it here, right? You remove that hash, yeah, you can get this, and then once you want to print that, just refresh and you can see the color is already here. I'm going to refresh as well. All right, so this is one good site, HTML color codes, where you can find various types of colors. You can find RGB, you can find in hexacode decimal. If you have a name of the color, you can just use the name of the color, dark and light of it, and you can start working with the colors. Right? So let's look at another example on the text. What type of options we have for the text. So I'm going to copy paste this, paste it for text, and I'm going to remove all the CSS. Right, and we'll remove the boxes as well. For the text, I'm going to copy paste the lorem ipsum so that we have some text to play around. Alright, so what I've done is I've copy pasted the text, that's lorem ipsum, and also have pasted some of the properties like font family. You can specify the font name. Well, font size is your size of the font. Font style is basically italics, normal or oblique. Then the weight, how much bolder you want. And then transform, you can transform into uppercase, lowercase. Decoration, you can have underline, overline. Then you can also have a shadow. Okay, so let's play around with our text now. I'm going to close this. So open up the text live preview. I'm going to change this to text. Right? So that's our text. The first thing we'll play around with the first letter. So we'll say first letter, and we'll say font size is 200%. Okay, that's increase that L there. Okay, you can even have first line. Okay, you can have a text shadow, none. Okay, so we removed the shadow from the first line, and then we'll try to add the shadow now. Okay, now we'll try to add all those settings for your font settings for your paragraph. Okay, first thing we will change is we will change the font type. Okay, so we'll say font family. The first thing you mention is the font name, so I'm say Times New Roman. Then you will say what type of font you want. You want the serif font, and then I'm gonna say font size is 20px. Okay, right there you see the 20px font already. Then line height 2 em, that's the height, that's the spacing between the line, each line. You can see the spacing between each line. Then you can say letter spacing as well between each letter. Okay, so you can say 0.2 em, so there's a spacing right there between each alphabet. Then you can have word spacing as well. Okay, word spacing you can say 1 em, so you have this space between each word, right? Then you can make the font style as italics, so it's italic now, right? Next we'll apply font weight as bold, so it's bold now. Okay, then we can say text transform to uppercase. Okay, so let's do text indentation now. This is indent, right? Then we'll add a text shadow, and we'll add the shadow all around with the red color, right? So this is how your text looks like now. Okay, so you can see the power of CSS. You can actually do anything you want with the text. You can add spaces between the word, you can add spaces between the letter, you can decide how your shadow should look like, how your text should look like, you want how big your font size will be. Okay, it's just few simple settings you can actually play around with the text, and this is the output you can just do with the CSS itself. Here's some of the reference I gave you. Obviously there will be a lot of CSS rules applied for text, but these are the basic ones that you will find yourself using a lot. Well, that's all about colors and text in this lecture, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture. Let's do some quick review and some things to remember before you finish this section. So first thing, CSS stands for cascading style sheet. That is the full form of CSS. CSS is used to design the content on the web page. That's the purpose of CSS. CSS can be written inside the HTML page. You can write inside the tag or outside in a separate file. CSS should be written in .css file, which you can include in the HTML file as well. Then we learned about types of selectors, universal selectors, type selectors, class selectors, ID selectors, attribute selectors, child selectors, descendant selectors, adjacent, sibling selectors, general, adjacent selectors. Well, we have seen all the selectors and we have worked through all the examples of this. Then we have looked at pseudo classes, which is written using colon, and pseudo element, which is written using double colons. On the CSS rules, we saw two important rules. First one was inline CSS has the higher precedence. So anything that you write CSS on the tag will get the higher precedence. If you manually want to emphasize that you want some rule to have higher precedence, then you use something called as exclamatory mark important. They used to give higher precedence to that particular rule. Okay, so these were the things we covered in this section, and I hope you have understood what is the purpose of CSS, how to write CSS, and what types of selectors are available, and how you can apply your design to your HTML tags. Alright, so that's all for this lecture, and I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the section summary. So by now you should be able to understand what is CSS. You should know how to write CSS in HTML file via inline, internal, external, and linking. You should also understand how to write and debug CSS. You should know how to create CSS selectors in different ways. You should know what are pseudo classes and elements. Then you should understand what is CSS rules and which has the higher precedence. Then you should know how to add colors and text to your website. Alright, so that's all we have learned in this section. So let's move on to the next section now.